Really grateful that you've joined us. I do want to just put this caveat out there. It's really important that you understand that um, Tulane University, the Office of Parent Programs, all these different partners who are here representing different departments cannot recommend any particular apartments or landlords, neighborhoods, or businesses related to off-campus housing. The purpose of this webinar is to give you some resources and things to think about so that you can investigate those options in a more informed, purposeful way. So just be aware of that limitation that we have. Just since those are all private businesses, we just can't kind of get in the middle of that and make recommendations one way or the other. So just to remind you, so your microphones are muted, chat's disabled, but you'll have a chance to type in questions. I would please ask that you hold those questions until I prompt you, because we've tried to anticipate a lot of those questions and we've done this several times, so we know the topics that are uppermost in your mind. It'll help me be more efficient in finding the questions that we haven't addressed by the time we get to the end of the webinar. And then we will post this in many different places. So we'll post it on the Government Relations website so the students can access it. We'll post the recording on the parent website so parents can get it. And all registrants, whether they were able to join us today or not, will get an email with the links and the PDF of the slides. So it's easy to refer to this information again later. So don't worry about having to scribble down a long URL to something or things like that. You'll get this reference material. So here's the topic outline. I shared all of this with you who had registered by Monday, just to give you a sense of, the topics we'll run through. There we are. And then I want to introduce our panelists. So we have a great group of folks with us. So Lauren Jardell is the Director of Local Government and Community Relations with Tulane University. So she brings a great perspective on the local neighborhood, and she's that liaison between Tulane and our local university neighborhood folks. Tim Limford is the Director of Housing and Residence Life. And then Kyle Rice is one of his team members, who's the Associate Director for Housing Operations. So they can provide that context of what if you're still trying to determine between on and off, or you've got questions about that as you consider the possibilities for the future, that will be helpful. We have Greg Nichols, who is the retained civil counsel with our Tulane Legal Assistance Program, which goes by the acronym TULAP. And that is something we'll discuss a little bit more, but that's a great resource for current students. So we're gonna move on to that first topic to give you sort of that big picture context, and Lauren's gonna talk about these issues.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you all for joining us. We're very excited that you're here and interested in this. I would also like to add that in addition to serving as the university's liaison with the neighbors, I also serve as the university's liaison with the city government. So in saying that, we know that this time is one that can be very exciting for students. The thought of more independence and living off campus can be a lot of fun, but we hope that it's one that is also a safe experience. And so for some of that to happen, there does need to be a better understanding of the responsibilities that comes with the independence and freedom of living off campus. And that is about honoring local laws, university expectations, respecting neighbors. So we hope that this will provide a little bit more information and clarity on some of the big issues that vex our neighbors and sometimes the local government and just general university and community relations. One issue that I do want to bring to your attention that is a very current hot button issue in the neighborhood surrounding campus is the issues of doubles to dorms. This issue is one that you may be experiencing in your home cities as well, but developers are buying properties in the neighborhoods near the campus and converting them from a traditional double into a more higher occupancy residence that maybe includes, up to 4 or 5 apartments instead of just 2. The neighbors are watching this very closely. Some of these developers are violating zoning ordinances and creating the higher occupancy residence. So one thing just to be careful of is if you are looking at a property that maybe is under construction or renovation, just to understand that you need to pay attention to its zoning and that it's complying with laws, that the developer's complying with the laws, because some properties, the work on some properties has been stopped due to zoning appeals and even court orders. So there's a list that the neighbors are compiling and have compiled on the townofcarrolltonwatch.org website that's in the slides. And that's just one list. I can't, claim that it's 100% accurate or up to date, but the neighbors are watching this issue closely. And then lastly, the off-campus guide. Hopefully most of you received it in the mail over winter break. We did time that this year to go out over winter break in the hopes that students are home and able to talk to their parents about these issues and what they're looking at in apartments. We know it's not always the perfect timing, but that's just how it worked out this year. And this year we also targeted that mailing to sophomores, since you are most likely in the process of looking for an off-campus housing now. And then it's always available online at the government relations website. And if you Google Tulane government relations, that's actually the easiest way to find it. It'll show up, and it's under, I believe, community resources. So it's kind of big picture, hot topics.
Thank you, Lauren. We appreciate that. Once you get this PDF of the slides, you'll also be able to link through to that spot where it says online and find that guide. Also, because that guide is so comprehensive, we are not going to repeat all of that material in this webinar. So we're going to hit sort of the highlights of things in order to leave more time for questions, since we know you can refer to details in the guide. So next here, make sure I can advance. So we're going to have our colleagues from Housing and Residence Life talk about those on-campus considerations as you're considering and weighing the on versus off question. I'll turn things over to Tim and Kyle.
Thank you so much, Penny. So as our rising junior and senior students begin to make decisions about where they're going to live, it is important to know that there are still opportunities for juniors and senior students to live on campus. All first and second year students at the university are required to live on campus unless they are over the age of 21, married, or living at home at their permanent residence. So if you, and we determine that based on how long you've been on campus, not your credit standing. So if you are just heading into your second year at the university, you should be planning to return to on-campus living for a second year. But for our third and fourth year students, we do house a good number of juniors and seniors on campus every year. We have several hundred spaces for these students. And if you are interested in living in on-campus housing, you can apply for that. Our application is open currently, and you will want to do so soon. We're going to talk about our timeline on the next slide. But our application deadline is tomorrow. So this is wonderful that you're here today. It's perfect timing. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that timeline is, what happens if you apply but don't select, or if you select a space and then cancel later. So as you can see, tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. is when our application closes for 2021-2022 housing for next year. For students that are not sure yet if you want to live on campus or off campus, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and submit a housing application. It takes all of about 10 minutes. And when you go through the application, you'll provide preferences to us, you'll sign a housing agreement, but junior and senior students aren't actually selecting a room space until about mid-March. And once you select a room space, that is when you're subject to the housing agreement and the penalties therein. And so there is no harm in going ahead and putting in a housing application now. And maybe in the next month, if you find that space for yourself, you know, there's no cancellation fee for just not selecting a room through that process. So as you can see, our juniors and seniors will be selecting their housing on March 17th and 18th. So that gives you a little bit of time. We have a lot of information on our website regarding the returning student room selection. You can find this at that link below. And we've also done a on-campus housing reapplication process webinar, which Penny has archived on the parent programs website.
All right, I'll jump in at this point. Nice to see you all today. Thanks for being a part of this. So as Kyle was just talking a little bit about, we really do encourage students who are considering to live on campus still next year to go ahead and fill out that housing agreement. There are cancellation components to our housing agreement. And I do encourage any student that is completing the agreement online to make sure that they're familiar with what those cancellation terms look like. I will say that students are going to be able to cancel their request to cancel their housing agreement. And if that's approved, they would then receive a prorated refund of their housing fees based upon, oh, Penny, go ahead and go back one for just a second. Based upon the date in which they move out. It's not necessarily you know, and I should say that's particularly what we're going to want to make sure that we're paying attention to. So please do make sure that you're familiar with what those dates are, and then we'll go ahead to that next slide now too. Those dates are based on wanting to make sure that we're sure that the students who really want to live on campus are contracted with us. So the reason you'll see in this slide is that the cancellation penalties continue to increase as time goes on is because it becomes increasingly difficult for us to find students to be living on campus once we get deeper and deeper into the summer, because many of you who are thinking about living off campus start to secure those leases and so on. So I call your attention to these dates because sometimes I think students sort of gloss over this section of our housing agreement, and we want to make sure that you're familiar familiar with that. I will say, as far as cancellation penalties go, there's some question around study abroad and what that's going to look like for next year. For those students who are approved to study abroad in a university-approved program, by practice, we do waive those cancellation penalties for those students who are approved. So if you're in sort of a holding pattern at this point with regards to study abroad, definitely do go ahead and apply on campus without that worry. Now, I will say, as soon as you know that that study abroad has come through, we do ask that you go ahead and let us know and cancel that agreement. Last thing that I'll actually also mention too, as it relates to on-campus to off-campus, it's not in the slides, but I know a number of folks have asked about that transition. So if you're a sophomore, for example, and you're living in the residence halls currently and thinking about, okay, well, if I'm going to live off campus next year, do I need to move all of my stuff home and then bring it back to New Orleans again in the fall? University and Student Services is our corporate partner that helps us with summer storage. And so there's some information that's going to be coming out shortly with regards to summer storage opportunities for students. So you'll be able to store your belongings with this group, and they actually offer free delivery to off-campus properties within I think it's just a couple of mile radius of the campus in August. So they have been terrific to work with for our on-campus program, and I think that folks will find that from a summer storage standpoint that they're also really terrific to work with. So there'll be more information on that coming shortly.
Okay, so I want to mention just some of the first things to think about in this off versus on consideration. So if you're starting to think about the possibilities of living off campus, for the students who are joining us and parents who want to discuss these things with your students, here are a few things I'll just quickly say. You have to be ready and willing to take on that responsibility, or kind of prepare yourself mentally and emotionally to do this by the time you're back on campus, back in your apartment next fall. So being considerate and assertive enough to negotiate those living arrangements with your roommates. You're not going to have the university staff to facilitate roommate agreements or help mediate conflicts and things. So something to think about. You have to be able to do that on your own and be willing to do that. You also have to be assertive and conscientious enough to communicate with a landlord or repair people and other folks that are not a part of the university that you've benefited from, heretofore. So just being ready to do that as a part of living off campus. And also, as Lauren has mentioned, being a mature and considerate neighbor to those around you who are of all ages, families, singles, elderly people. And so they're not just all college students like you've lived with in a residence hall environment. And then just taking on the time and energy to handle the extra responsibilities along with all of your academic and co-curricular responsibilities, or if you're a senior, maybe applying to graduate school or doing a job search. So things to think about, balancing everything. Get ready for that. Another thing that I will mention is just that we've got some great resources to help students in taking on this new responsibility and some of the really specific elements of this transition. And so I would like to turn things over now to Greg, who will talk about how he can help you understand the leases and tenant-landlord relations in New Orleans. Thanks, Greg.
There we go. Had to figure out how to unmute myself there. Can everybody hear me, I hope? So hi, my name is Greg Nichols. I'm been the civil attorney for the Tulane Legal Assistance Program for going on 20 years now. And every year I think I've seen it all, and every year it turns out I'm wrong. So, but what I'm going to try to do is give you guys an idea of, it's very exciting to move from off campus and into the world of New Orleans. It's wild and woolly. It's largely unregulated, but going in with some ideas of, what you need to know in advance before you sign a lease or move into a place, it will help you pack a pretty good toolkit for dealing with hopefully 90% of the stuff that you'll come up and encounter. So some of the things have been touched on already, and some are probably common sense in terms of what you need to know when moving into a place. But one of the earliest lessons I learned, which I'll pass on as just personal knowledge, is correctly picking housemates who you can live with. And you might be really good friends with somebody, but they might not be a good roommate. And that's a judgment call. That's something that I can't really tell you too much about. It's just a personal choice. But one of the biggest problems that we come across over the legal assistance program is students who, after several weeks or several months, realize that for various reasons they can no longer coexist, and they want to end their lease. And that can be a problem for us because we're funded by student government, and so we have an inherent conflict of interest. If somebody comes to me and says, my roommate is a problem, how do I get rid of him? We can't answer that if they're a Tulane student. So nipping that in the bud and making sure that if you're a slob, your roommates are slobs, or if you're a neat freak, your roommates are neat freaks. To minimize conflict with people you're going to be living with for at least the next year is a good first step. Okay, so moving on from that, we want to look at the first thing that you're going to be looking at when you move in, other than the house itself, is the lease. And it's axiomatic, and it goes without saying that you want to read your lease, but most of you probably have never read a lease before, or at least you haven't done it repeatedly, and you might not have a real good idea of what the lease terms mean. And so to that end, before you're signing a lease, and probably I know that a lot of you right now are looking for leases that you're going to sign for June, that become effective in June, and then you're going to be taking occupancy in August. So you're looking now. The Tulane Legal Assistance Program is open, and I always tell people who come to me with lease questions that my favorite thing in the world is somebody who comes to me with questions about their lease before they've signed it, as opposed to after. So I fully encourage you to make an appointment to see me. Our contact information is in your materials. And so you can come and see me, well, virtually at this point. And we'll take a look at your lease, take a look at what might be concerning, and allay your concerns as to things that might not be. and possibly give you some input into how to modify your lease. Which brings me to my, to the next issue. When you're looking over the lease, you might see some terms in there that you don't necessarily agree with. Landlords will sometimes, especially for some of the more competitive properties around campus, and I think you probably all know the areas that I'm talking about, within a couple of blocks of the Boot and, right near Broadway and all that, Octavia, that whole area. The landlord has got a line of 20 people waiting behind you to rent the place if you're not going to. And if you want to propose some changes to the lease, they're not going to agree because the next guy coming along isn't going to even bother to read the lease, let alone make changes. But I still encourage you to try. If there's something in there that you find fundamentally problematic, or if you come to see me and I say this is a problem, suggest it to the landlord. And it can be simple. It can be as simple as taking a pen and writing in a lease a change that you want to make, and then you both initial it, and that is legally binding. If you won't do it, then you're going to have to make a decision about whether or not this is a place you're going to want to live based on those, based on those conditions. Because of course, once you sign the lease, whether you read it or not, whether you really agreed to the terms or not, that is a binding document that you're bound to for the next year. All right. Now, what are your rights in Louisiana as a tenant? Unfortunately, there aren't many. There isn't much to it. You're obviously protected by state and federal fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. You are entitled to a warranty of habitability, that the property you're renting is fit for its intended purpose. And other than that, whatever the lease says, as lawyers like to say, you're restricted by the four corners of the lease. That's the law between you and your landlord. So you may find that and we'll talk a little bit about this, because what you're going to want to do as far as the property goes is inspect it. But let's say that you're inspecting your property and you find out that there is a dishwasher, but the dishwasher does not work, or it works inadequately. And you say to your prospective landlord, well, we wanted to get this place because it's got a dishwasher. We'd like this fixed. And the landlord says, no problem. You guys move in August, that dishwasher will be fixed. The next thing you're going to want to say is, that's great. And I'm just going to put in the line at the end here that landlord agrees to have dishwasher fixed by August 1st. Right? And then you both initial that. And if he says, we don't need to do that, you can trust me. Well, don't. This is a business relationship. And if he's telling you that he doesn't want you to write something into the lease, it's because he doesn't plan to do it. And the reason is, if it doesn't wound up getting written into the lease, it's not binding. So if you make a request for a list of repairs, you move in, none of those repairs are done, the landlord can say, hey, we negotiated that out of the lease. We didn't put it into the lease, so I don't have to do any of that. And he's right. So it might be a little tough to try and call landlord on it, but you just need to bear in the back of your mind, that you're entering a business relationship, and you have to treat it as such with a trust but verify kind of mentality. All right. Now, on moving into a property, after you've inspected it and made sure that everything that is going to be taken care of is going to be taken care of, you want to make sure that you're thinking ahead to the end of the lease. And you want to make sure that because the only requirement in Louisiana for renting a property when you return it is that it's broom swept and free of trash and returned in like condition that you rented it, unless the lease specifies otherwise. But that's the basic rule. So, everybody's got phones now. Walk through the place, take as many pictures and video as you can, so that if there are conditions that arise during the lease, you know that it was caused by you, or if there are conditions that existed when you rented the place that are still there at the end, the landlord isn't blaming you for them and trying to take them out of your security deposit. It seems it's probably an obvious thing to say, but it's really important to do that at the beginning of the lease. And then after you've moved everything out, do exactly the same thing again. And then when you're making your request for your security deposit, if you get a list of deductions from your security deposit the landlord says that you caused damage for, you've got hard and solid proof that that is not true. That can cure 90% of the problems in terms of a landlord who's intent on keeping your security deposit for nefarious reasons. The other thing that you'll want to remember upon moving out, and we're just touching on some highlights here because I realize we don't have a lot of time. We can always talk, you can ask questions about the stuff after, but going back to reading your lease, when you rent a property for a year, you might think that it's a year and that's it. And that's sometimes true, sometimes not, because most leases, in Louisiana will contain what's called a reconduction clause or a renewal clause. And that clause will say that if one party or the other wants to end the lease at the end of the first term, the 1-year term, then that party must give notice within a certain time frame to the other party that the lease is ended. If you don't, then guess what? At the end of that lease term, you've got a new lease. Might be for a month, might be for a year, but if you move out at the end of what you thought was your 1 year without giving that notice, you've broken your lease and you're not going to get your deposit back. And for the most part, those notice terms will be like 30 days. But again, for some of the hotter properties, you know, a lot of you are looking right now in February for properties that you're not going to live until August. There's 90 or 120 or 180 days notice that you have to give, because the landlord needs to know if that property is going to be open in August when people are looking for it in February. So if you are thinking, well, my lease is up in August, and you haven't really read your lease carefully, and it says, I got to give notice by the end of February, that's binding. So just make sure that you see that and you know that, and that you send to your landlord in a way that if you're going to be moving at the end of the term, that you can show later on that you gave him notice within the time frame of what the lease says. Otherwise, you could have a real problem where you have an entire new lease term that you didn't plan on having. Touching on that issue again, a lot of you all are looking for properties, as I said, in August. You're renting it now, finding a lease now. The lease begins in June, and the landlord is going to be collecting rent for June, July, August, when you're not going to be there. Now, this isn't really something that has come up, but it can. And so you want to make sure that the landlord understands, and it's written into the lease, that you are not going to be occupying the property during those months, and that somebody can come by and inspect. Because one of your obligations as a tenant, in addition to obviously paying rent and being a good neighbor, is to ensure that that somebody is living in the property so they can tell the landlord if something goes wrong. And I've had it happen where a student was not at a property, that there was a fire, and that the landlord had said, well, don't worry about it. I'm just gonna go to my insurance company. And there was like $90,000 in damages. And guess what happens? The insurance company sues the students for violating the occupancy clause. So make sure that it's written into the lease that if you're not gonna be there during the summer, that it's written into the lease that you're not. And that it's the landlord's job to make sure that the property is being taken care of during the time that you're not there. Just some other things that you want to generally know about during the course of the lease in terms of if things kind of go bad, if you have a problem with your roommate, you can't live with them anymore, the neighborhood is bad. None of that stuff is going to get you out of your lease, and there could be a wide variety of things that could give rise to that. But I'd encourage you to come see us over at the Tulane Legal Assistance Program if that happens, because there are certain ways, even though it amounts to breaking a contract, that you can do it with a minimal amount of risk to yourself. And so I don't want you to think that if you're in the middle of your lease and you just realize you made a huge mistake and the place is absolutely dangerous and horrible, that you're stuck there for the entire year. Yes, there are risks inherent in moving. Yes, it amounts to a breach of the lease, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the world, and it doesn't mean you have to endure it. So knowing what your rights are and knowing how you can use the law to your advantage to get yourself out of a bad situation is something that we can always help you with. And that's about all I have. I guess we can hold on for questions afterwards if that's what we're going to do.
Greg, would you just mention the issue of subletting?
Yeah, good question. I was skipping over a lot because, but that's one I don't want to skip over. Most leases will prohibit subletting. And I want to clarify what subletting is, because a lot of people consider a situation like I just described, where you have a problem with your roommate and you're moving out and the roommate is getting somebody else in to replace you. That's not subletting. That's somebody moving out and somebody else moving in. Subletting is, obviously, like the best example is you're moving abroad for a semester, which I think we might not be looking at in the interim, but for the sake of argument. And you want somebody to take your place while you're gone, right? You're not moving out completely. You want somebody to take your place when you're gone. And so those obligations attach to the new tenant, but they also attach to you, even though you're not there. So you need to make sure that you sublease to somebody who's responsible, who you can trust to carry out your obligations, because if they don't, then it still falls back to you. The threshold issue, though, is that most leases are going to prohibit subleasing outright. And so if you're going to be signing a lease where you know that in advance you're going to be subletting, you want to make sure that the landlord understands that. and that that provision is either taken out of the lease or that he gives advance permission for you to do it in the lease to do so. Now, the distinction I made between subletting and moving out is important, because let's assume that there's a situation where one of the tenants, you're the tenant that you want to move out, you can't take your roommates anymore, so you move out and you quote unquote sublease to somebody else. You don't want to do that because, as I said a moment ago, when you sublease, the obligations still attach to you. So if you move out, somebody else moves in, and then that person moves out, the landlord and or your roommates can come back against you, because as long as the sublease is in effect, you're still bound by those obligations. So you want to make sure that it's actually a release from the lease that you are obtaining, as opposed to a sublease, and you want to make sure that that's written. And again, this is something we do with the legal assistance program all the time, where we can write an agreement where the lease obligations as to one particular tenant end when they move out.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. Thanks for filling us in on those features and those issues.
Oh, there is one unrelated issue I wanted to touch on. In reading your lease, one of the main issues that we come across, it seems like a minor issue, but it's not when you're dealing with it, is that leases are often silent, or at least give a landlord wide latitude on coming into the property, disturbing your possession, right? And so repairmen come in to fix things, and this is going on in terms of renovations going on and everything. I think this is with a lot of these properties getting renovated from duplexes into fourplexes and such. This is going to be an increasing problem. Unless the lease actually specifies that the landlord cannot come in, or his agents can't come in during certain hours or without advance notice, they can come tromping through your apartment whenever they want to. There's no rule on that in Louisiana. And most leases don't consider that at all. And so I strongly recommend that you read through the lease, look for the landlord's rights to access, and limit it to say two things. Number one, that this is all in the event that it's not an emergency, right? This would be just for inspection or ordinary repairs or that sort of thing. The landlord has an absolute right to come in if there's an emergency that threatens the property. But under those circumstances, that they only come in between business hours, say 9 and 5, Monday through Friday, and that they only do so by providing you advance written notice 24 hours in advance. If you don't have those provisions in there, and then you find that your landlord or his agents are coming through without masks whenever they want to, ignoring your requests not to come in, there's not a lot you can do about it at that point. So I highly recommend making sure that that's included in any lease you sign.
Very important. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think especially since students that are going to class in person, but sometimes you're also, joining class remotely from your apartment, then that kind of an interruption can be, bigger now than it might have been before you were taking some classes from your apartment sometimes.
And certainly, with some of these apartments going through extensive renovations, you can imagine what it's like when you've got, a dozen workers tromping through with power tools while you're trying to study. It's having that could be a real savior to your student career.
So I'll just mention some things for students to think about, or parents to guide your students in considering when they are considering those roommates, because as Greg said, you can't, once you all sign a lease together, then you're bound to them. So thinking ahead of time really carefully about balancing again that independence versus the responsibility. A lot of times students are looking to move from that, sharing a room with someone, in a double room on campus, and trying to find more privacy, but they're still going to have shared living spaces, with kitchens and living rooms and other kinds of space. So something to definitely consider, that there's still going to be sharing going on. So thinking ahead in advance, or using that thought, as they examine spaces in different apartments, is important to consider. There is a link here that has some information about how to share the expenses. So it helps kind of calculate that. And then it's also really important, if at all possible, for all the roommates to visit and investigate the property together, or even if they have to go separately, to see it before they sign. Sometimes just trusting somebody else to have the same standard of what you're looking for in an apartment could be risky to have someone do that for another 2 or 3 people. So I think that's really important to try to manage that situation in searching apartments so that all the students could have seen it and keep track of that. So another few things I'll just mention, and I think somebody else has already said this, that you have to really carefully consider this and project yourself into this situation that we're talking about living on your own off campus with these new responsibilities. That sometimes your very best friend in the whole wide world is not the very best roommate in the whole wide world. So it's really important to discuss some of these practical implications really honestly and openly before you move in together. And even better, if you make a written agreement about these things, it certainly helps keep the peace. If they've all been discussed, agreed upon, written down, everybody, makes a commitment to that. And some things to look at are cleaning expectations, like some other people have mentioned, and who's going to be responsible for different things, how you're going to manage the joint common space as opposed to your individual rooms or the bathrooms that might be shared. How are you going to manage groceries and supplies? You're going to keep those separate or do some things together and some things separate. Handling the utilities, figuring out what you are comfortable having other people share, your food, your clothes or not. How to handle guests. What is allowable for overnight guests or, visitors of other kinds. And then I think a very important thing to think about now, given our environment with the COVID-19 virus, is how does everybody else that you're considering living with approach the COVID-19 precautions and best practices about being safe, as well as how do they approach their compliance to the city and university policies and guidelines? Because those are things we've definitely heard about this year as people have tried to navigate through this. We certainly all hope that things will get much better and people will get vaccinated and it won't be as salient an issue next year, but I think we will still be dealing with many pieces of this. And so it's certainly something to have in your conversation, not just about groceries, not just about overnight guests, but talk about how you approach that and make sure everybody's on the same page. So a few things just in terms of the search considerations. Certainly you have to consider budget, and I think it's really smart to make a worksheet. And one thing to consider is whether or not you're getting any need-based aid and how that might affect how your need is calculated, because they usually use an on-campus figure to plug in to calculate all of that. So that is something that students and families should definitely check with a financial aid advisor, financial aid counselor, to figure that out ahead of time and see how that might be affected. And then you have to account for all of these different things, utilities, because those are not always included in the cost of the apartment, the monthly lease, rate. Personal items, food. There are commuter meal plans that dining services offers if students want the convenience of eating on campus and might want to investigate one of those and then know that maybe in the evenings and the weekends they'll cook at home in their apartment. But calculating all that is really important. The other thing that is important to remember is to account for emergency situations. And so I think that there's really good information in the off-campus living guide about that. But the things that you have enjoyed on campus with the Tulane staff taking care of bottled water and meals when the dining halls weren't open and having food available and those kind of things, those are all things that students would have to do on their own when they're living off campus. So being stocked up for batteries and water and other supplies are just important to consider in the whole thing of living off campus. Other things are, of course, location. We definitely know that students want to live as close to campus as possible, but it's important to see those spaces and also consider the transportation if it's going to be farther away, or what the parking possibilities might or might not be, and whether or not a city permit is required, and whether or not you would need to have a permit for on-campus parking if you think you would be driving to campus. Certainly safety is an issue. There's a link here for the NOPD crime maps if you want to get some sense of just the prevalence or incidence of crime over time in different areas. So you can look at that to kind of zero in on particular neighborhoods. The other thing that is available to students, if they already have a leased property, then TUPD officers will perform an assessment to make safety best practice recommendations for students. And to do that, students should email this communitypolicing@tulane.edu to request and schedule an appointment. And they'll review it with the student once they have a lease and point out all those things and make some good recommendations that students can do or could discuss with their landlord if they wish. So the other thing to consider in all this is the amenities, of course. You know, a lot of times what students are focusing on is number of bedrooms and does it have Wi-Fi included and those kinds of things. But it's really important to be careful about that when they're examining apartments, make sure they're keeping track of which options they're looking at, you know, include any utilities or don't, and getting some sense of what those fees might be. And so some could include electricity or water, but might not include cable or internet. And students will be responsible for managing and setting up those things. And usually all of those things require deposits. So it's an additional thing to factor into the setup cost for moving off campus. So we mentioned this in the guide, but the strategies that students use to find off campus are exploring particular zip codes to be close to campus. So I know that could be helpful for parents just to kind of see the map and know where students who live uptown near the university are, you know, landing. And some consideration you might want to use is to look at the Tulane shuttle routes and the fact that Tulane Police Department patrols within a mile radius of campus. And so it's good to be within that radius if possible. The one thing to consider, though, is that there are not a lot of really big multi-unit apartment complexes in the uptown area. And so if your student were looking for something like that, then that's definitely going to be farther away and require transportation and all of that. Students use they tell us that they use a couple of Facebook groups. They are not managed or monitored by Tulane, but the couple that we hear about are called Tulane Classifieds and Tulane Housing Sublets and Roommates. And I think they're both private, so they would have to join those in order to be able to see the postings there. And people post both properties, roommates wanted, and, you know, roommates needed, and looking for a roommate kind of posts in that. People use bulletin boards on campus or local coffee shops. The other thing to consider is using a rental agency. So we can't recommend any particular one, but there are certainly ones you can easily find online that are near the uptown area, the university neighborhood, and they specialize in some rentals in those neighborhoods. And one thing that's important to remember that could be different where you live is that here, the property owners, the landlords, pay the rental agent, the agents. So you are not having to pay an agent a finder's fee. The agent collects a commission from the owner. So that can be more helpful in trying to use an agent to help with that whole process. Certainly our students learn about properties. Word of mouth from older students is really important to kind of network really persistently and intentionally to find out about properties that might be coming available. So I'll turn things over to Lauren to talk about more of the tenant and good neighbor responsibilities.
Thanks, Penny. I'm going to cover this very broadly. Much of this information is in the guide with much greater detail. And also I know that we wanted to have some time for question and answers. So really the thing here, the big things here to remember are, one, both landlords and tenants are responsible for the condition of the property. And that includes yard, trash, and pests. I mean, essentially, as Greg mentioned, your landlord's biggest responsibility is to make sure that the residence is habitable prior to leasing it. And while you're in the residence, it's your responsibility to, you know, make sure the day-to-day maintenance and cleanliness is handled. The Tulane Code of Conduct applies to off-campus behavior, and that includes, you know, everything from alcohol to noise to trash and parking violations. You know, the city of New Orleans has some kind of quirks in its laws, some nuances, I would say, around parking. You know, parking is not allowed in front yards in this part of the city. And there's some restrictions on, you know, how much of a side yard can be paved and used for parking. So, you know, while you might not get a ticket for that, it is technically against the law and is something that neighbors are reporting repeatedly because it's a zoning violation. So just be aware of those kinds of things. And then at the end of the day, just remember that, you know, the neighbors are just like your parents or grandparents. You know, some of them are Tulane graduates themselves. They may have a student or child or grandchild enrolled, so they could be related to your classmates, you know, or faculty and staff. So do, you know, be mindful of where you are for both your safety and for respect of the neighborhood and the neighbors. So if you want to go ahead and do question and answers, Penny, I know we're running out of time, but it might be.
I apologize, I forgot to unmute myself. So, so now it's time for you to type in questions and we'll see how many we can get to. Just a reminder, I'll show you the panelist contact information if you want to reach them directly, and you'll get this, the video and the PDF of the slides. Also, if you have feedback about this webinar or suggestions for other topics, please let us know. You can email parents@tulane.edu. So, let's see. So here's one that says it's regarding the leasing agreements. I understand why it's important to register one's lease with the city. It protects the tenant against a potential sale of the property and then being booted out. One particular group they've been working with has a clause in the lease that states if you register this lease with New Orleans, we will have the right to terminate your lease immediately. So they're telling tenants that what seems to be, you know, a practice and a legal practice in the city is not acceptable to that particular tenant. So Greg, do you have any?
There's actually a fairly innocent explanation for that, and there's probably a pretty easy solution. It might sound like they're trying to restrict the tenant from his rights. What it really is probably about is it's a way for a landlord to keep tenants from comparing the rents that they pay. So it might not seem like something that people would do. It's actually probably more applicable to commercial leases, but they don't want people going and looking up publicly available lease information and saying, well, this guy's paying $500 a month less than I am. Why is that? And, you know, that creating a conflict, and then that would be the reason why. If that is the landlord's motivation, the simple solution is to simply request that and whether or not that's his problem. If the lease says you cannot record this lease, you can record what's called an extract of the lease, which simply states, you know, the bare bones information of the fact that who is renting it, who is being rented from, what the term of the lease is. And it's something that we can generate at the Tulane Legal Assistance Program. And if a lease does prohibit recording the lease, a lease extract, which is permitted by the Civil Code and the Code of Civil Procedure, doesn't violate that provision.
Okay, so here's another question that I'll go to Greg. Or I think I can answer part of this. So it says, it seems like there's a lot to consider and do before signing a lease. If the best places go really quickly, how can you get their lease reviewed?
Yeah.
And have Tulane Police Department check for safety, have everybody do it, meet with Greg, what's the normal action plan? So I'd like to say a couple of things about that. First of all, it's really more that TUPD can do an assessment after the lease is signed, after the apartment is secured, to give some suggestions for the students to think about and maybe act upon. Definitely, because that time frame can go so quickly, they don't have there's not enough of them to do that, to see, multiple places that may be looked at, but they can give a really great suggestions and look over everything. I also will send in the email a list of things to look for that are safety related. So I didn't take up time on these slides to put all that, but I'm going to send you that. The other thing that I would say is that the landlord-tenant relations guide that Greg has compiled is wonderful. And it has lots of questions to look for. And you can kind of make your own template of that and kind of look at the lease and compare it to that. If you felt like you were already in that process and need more guidance about the things to be particular about in the lease. So if you don't always have that long window of time to have TLAP review it in detail before you do. So Greg, would you agree? I just feel like your guide is very, very comprehensive in detail.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly reviewing the guide is a good idea. And as to the question, I mean, I get it. You've got when you go to see a place, you may love it, and you tell the landlord, well, I just want to get my lawyer to look this over and possibly, and I took some video and I want my parents to see it, and so can I get back to you tomorrow? And the landlord looks at you like you're from Mars and says, it's going to be gone by tomorrow. I got 10 people looking at this place today. And you feel pressured into renting it right away. And I wish I had an easy answer for you. I don't. It's just, it's a balancing act that you have to strike. And so it's easy for me to say this now, but the best thing you can do is start looking early. And I know it's February and that's a little late now, but if you're going to be, to the extent that you can, start your search early. Start knowing the neighborhood. Whittle away the stuff that you don't want early on. If you go around, cruise through some different neighborhoods and narrow down the ones you don't want to be in early on, that's good. If you can do one of the best resources you can have is the internet, which everybody's got access to. If there's going to be an issue with a landlord because he's a nightmare, probably somebody before you has said that. And so just Googling the guy's name, figuring out the name of his company that's on the lease and Googling that, which you can do standing there talking to the guy, and finding out if there's a list of, and we're not going to talk about specific landlords here, but I can tell you that there are some landlords who are notorious and you never want to rent from. And if you contact me privately, I will talk to you about them. But basically, this is information that you can find out in advance. And so, yes, it may be difficult to get a consult on a lease beforehand. When you're being pressured to sign the lease. Yes, it might be difficult to conduct a search when you're being pressured by the landlord to rent it now or walk away. But I can't stress how important it is to make a good decision. There's always more places out there. Even if you lose a place you really like, you'll probably find another place that you like as much. And you kind of have to take into consideration that a landlord that's putting that kind of pressure on you might not be somebody you want to do business with anyway. Because ultimately it's kind of a marriage. It's a business relationship. You guys are going to be locked in together with you, landlord, your roommates for at least the next year. And it's a 5-figure obligation. And so while it may seem tempting to simply say, you know what, it's just a piece of paper, I'm going to sign it, really, to the extent that you can, at least look it over and take some of the things that we talked about here today to heart in terms of, making sure that your rights are protected on the front end. I can't stress how important that is, even in the face of the possibility that you're going to lose a place you really like.
Definitely read the guide. Read the guide. It's got great information. It'll definitely give you those parameters and the hot button issues to look for and help you so much. So this is one that could be helpful for you all to answer. The guide, the off-campus living guide that was sent home during the break, states that no more than 4 unrelated people can share a house, but the rental that they're looking at and several others that they know about have more than 4 tenants. So Lauren or Greg, can you answer that?
Yeah, I think, Penny, that needs to be clarified a little bit. It's that no more than 4 unrelated people can share a housing unit. So, if a house is divided into 4 apartments, then that means there could be 4 people in each of those 4 apartments. The city and the neighbors are well aware that, frequently this is violated. It is, I will say, hard to prove, but neighbors do report it from time to time. So it's something to be aware of and not ignore. It causes, part of this is because it causes a lot of issues density-wise with trash and with parking, with noise. These New Orleans properties are older. They're very close together, and so noise travels probably a little bit farther than most people think. You know, these are not suburban homes with big sprawling yards. Everybody's pretty much packed in on top of each other, and I promise you, you can hear the person in the house next door. Especially if there's, you know, 4 or 10 of them in that house. So just be cognizant of that. This also relates back to the doubles to dorm issue that I spoke to earlier. And increasing that density is a concern for neighbors in this area. So I would just caution you about living with too many people, and you should know that it is technically illegal.
So so somebody did ask if this would be recorded and available later, and yes, it will. Everybody who registered will get an email with the recording. We're running out of time. I'm going to try to find some questions that seem like they'd be applicable to a lot of folks. Average lease prices, I can't give you the best indication of that. I do think that taking a look in those Facebook groups, if you want to use those, again, they're not monitored by Tulane, but logging in or joining one of those and seeing sort of what some of the advertised rates are would be helpful. I would say, and maybe some of the other panelists would want to chime in here. I feel like I've seen everything from, you know, $500 to $1,000 a month, maybe depending on the configuration of the apartment, how big it is, you know, how updated it is. So definitely there's a range out there. And sometimes it might be more if it's just an apartment, you know, just for one person or a studio kind of space, than if it's a larger house that's, you know, a whole independent house. I would think that most of you are aware, but you know, the neighborhood architecture that we have right around the university has a lot of doubles, and so they're what we call shotgun doubles, where they're like mirror images of each other, and they're, you know, tenants in both sides, or sometimes they're duplexes where the apartments are on different floors, or they're large houses that have been carved into apartments. There might be a 1-bedroom and a 3-bedroom and a 2-bedroom on the second floor, so they could be a lot of different configurations, which does make for some charming spaces, but also makes it a bit more challenging in the search process. So we certainly understand that. So it's just important for them to know that. One of the things to look for is that there might be shotgun doubles that are still in the traditional room arrangement, where you walk through one room to get to the other. And so a good thing to look for in the advertisements or the promotions is that they have independent bedrooms or private bedrooms or something. That means you don't have to walk through your apartment mate's bedroom to get to the kitchen or the bath or the living room. So here's a little tip I'll offer. So I think that I'll try to find one more question. There are parking permits that students can get when they are, you know, older students who could be living off campus, that are commuter parking spaces that will allow them to park in certain places on campus. Is mostly the exterior lot at Claiborne and the Dival parking garage. And so the likelihood of finding a subletter for the summer or semester abroad really depends, I think, on how vigilant and diligent your student will be in just being persistent and looking for that, putting out the word through their networks, using whatever, you know, social media or other kinds of mechanisms are out there to communicate that and look for a subletter. But it's definitely something to consider, you know, that summer time that you have, or maybe a semester, or trying to team up with other people who are going to be away the same time you are, and then find an apartment for when you're returning. So I'll just turn things back to the panelists and ask if you thought of any last thing you'd like to say or recommend before we close. Anybody? No? Okay, then you'll see on this next slide, these are is the contact information for these wonderful folks who provided this information. So I'll just pause on that on the screen for a little bit. So if you want to jot down an email address really quickly, but again, we will send you this information very soon. It does take a couple of days for everything to get done with the video. So I would say don't expect the link to the video until next week, perhaps. But we'll send some follow-up information so you've got this reference material. If you'd like to just type in any comments now before we close about the webinar, or you want to give us some feedback, you can always send that to me at parents@tulane.edu, parents@tulane.edu, and I'll forward that on to my colleagues here who are on the panel. So we'd just like to thank everybody for being on the panel and providing this information. And we wish you luck in the search process and in the decision-making process. And we hope we've provided some good information to help guide you in that process. So everybody have a good afternoon, and just watch your email for